Professor Shija, chairperson of today's session, distinguished colleagues of the Department of Economics and the School of Social Sciences at the University of Kerala, and all other students who have made the effort of being here today to listen to my reflections on a topic or a theme which, in a sense, we all, in some senses, grasp or sense that something is, as far as India is concerned, India is today standing at a conjuncture where we do feel that all around stresses and strains are perceptible, but we are not necessarily clear about what exactly are the roots of these phenomena and what are the possible implications of this if these are not addressed. And I'd like to share with all of you my 2 bits on this, coming from the standpoint of my discipline, which is economics. While I do begin from the presumption that a social crisis is something more than something which is only an economic dimension, but I would suggest that there are economic underpinnings to the social crisis that we face. And the social character of the crisis lies in the fact that the social and political tendencies or forces unleashed by that underlying economic crisis are of such a nature as to not only produce these stresses and strains, but also imply that we are in a historical juncture in which all these mechanisms together do not seem to be working in a way as to allow this society to continue to function and reproduce in the way it has for several decades. Any society, no matter what its character, whether it's equal, unequal, whatever it is, any society needs to have social mechanisms which allow that society to keep on reproducing and sustaining. And by a social crisis, one is meaning that somehow the way these different mechanisms are today operating in our society, they are not necessarily operating in a way where they together are pushing towards a resolution of the crisis, instead are pushing in the direction of its deepening. So I have some data and graphs to substantiate what I am saying, but I will try and run through them quickly because there are a lot of them. I don't want to spend a lot of time on them, but I'll leave them here in case anyone wishes to look at them in closer detail later. But the essential point I want to make is the gist of what I am saying is the following: that if you look at the economic trajectory that India has followed in the last 3 decades or so, or a little more than that, what you can say is the period in which India inserts itself into a global process that has come to be called globalization. India's insertion into the process of globalization, partial in the 1980s, but more significantly since 1991, has been accompanied by a particular kind of economic trajectory, where you have had, of course, increased economic polarization within society. Economic polarization, a wide gulf between a minority at the top and the rest of Indian society, has emerged over the course of this movement over the last 30 years or so. This particular process of increasing inequality has as its basis itself a crisis, and a crisis that is only deepening, not getting resolved. But it has also produced additional elements or dimensions of the crisis. So in a sense, the polarization itself means that is underlying that process is a process where significant proportion of India's population is pushed into a crisis. It's losing out in this entire process of economic polarization is itself reflecting that there's a crisis there, which has allowed another part of Indian society to move far ahead over this period. But that process of leaving so many behind has also produced a crisis for the ones who have marched ahead. Okay. So there has been a process of generalization of the crisis, but the generalization of the crisis, however, does not lead to a tendency to eliminate that polarization, but in many ways exacerbates the contradictions that have arisen as a result. And the reflections of this in politics and in society are also not necessarily working towards making the crisis productive, in the sense that a crisis can also be a point from which a society emerges by addressing, in a sense, that a crisis can generate the tendencies which address the underlying causes and allow for a forward movement of that society. But the tendencies generated by this crisis are not necessarily always working in that direction. There are other tendencies. So we are caught between two different kinds of tendencies, one pushing towards aggravation of the crisis, others much more muted at the moment, which might resolve that crisis. And history will decide which one of them eventually is going to prevail. But my submission is that if the more productive possibilities of the crisis don't express themselves soon enough, there will be consequences of the other tendencies being allowed to thrive or survive for too long. In which case, the society as we know it may not be there to be, may not survive in many ways this particular crisis. So let me substantiate what I'm trying to say. So if you look at this, the world economy in the last 30 years, okay, there has been a process of a shift in the geography of world production. Okay. So while globalization was a process that was led by the West, the change geography of world production that has happened is that in this period, it is actually the so-called developing countries, the third world, and particularly in Asia, which have generally grown faster than the rest of the world. Okay. So you've had a change in the world situation, and India is part of that change, that India itself grows faster than the average for the world as a whole, and India also becomes part of a transition. So if you look at the panel at the bottom, that's the position in 1991. The panel at the top is 2021. Now, if you look at the dark green spots in the world, which are the high income economies of the world, that's not changed very much. So the high income economies of the world, it's not become an equal world. High income economies of the world remain roughly more or less where they were. Okay. But if you look at Asia particularly, it is not so prominent in Africa, it is virtually absent in Latin America. But if you look at the Asian continent, you do see a significant change in the colors. Okay. So from dark purple to light purple means a transition from, in the World Bank's classification, from low income to lower middle income status. And from purple to green means transition from lower middle income to, upper middle income, the transition. So you can see that Asia has been one of the centers where this transformation has happened, and India has been part of that. In 2007 is when India made the transition from being a low income economy to a lower middle income economy, which is of course only based on what is the average or per capita national income of the country. If you look at India relative to even its past, you can see that there is a transition that India is in some senses been catching up in this period in a way that it wasn't before. So up till the 1980s, the world economy was growing in such a way that actually most of the advanced economies, many of them were growing very rapidly, and therefore despite decolonization and despite the fact that many developing countries started growing faster than they had when they were under colonial rule, including India, they were not necessarily catching up because the advanced economies were growing faster. But after 1980, the advanced economies growth and the world economy's growth itself has slowed down. But a set of countries, particularly in Asia, have been the ones who have grown faster. India, therefore, in some senses has been catching up to the world average in this period. Okay. Now, if you look at the extent to which India has caught up and what its weight, therefore, in the world economy is, India has, because of its large population, has a natural basis to have a large weight in the world economy. Okay. But of course, India's share in the world GDP is significantly below its share in world population. But whether you look at its share in world GDP or whether you look at it in terms of its per capita income, India's position is far better. The notable thing in this table is India's position appears to be far better if you use one particular basis to compare, which is what we call the purchasing power parity basis. Okay, which is essentially you try and, instead of using the exchange rate between the dollar and the rupee to convert Indian rupees into their dollar, India's GDP and per capita GDP into the dollar equivalent, with which you can then compare with other countries, you look at what is what a dollar buys in the US relative to what you would need to spend in terms of rupees in India to purchase the same basket of commodities. As it turns out, on a purchasing power parity basis, the exchange rate between the US dollar and the Indian rupee is very different from what is the market exchange rate. So the market exchange rate is 85 or so rupees. If you look at what $1 purchased in the US, 21, 22 rupees can buy the same in India. So when you use purchasing power parity basis, India's position is much better. But whichever basis you take, you can see that amongst the G20 economies of the world, which are supposed to be the world's major economies, and the grouping together accounts for 3/4 of the world's. So there are 19 countries and then there's EU. So all the 19 countries are shown here, and you can see that amongst those 19 countries, India still relies primarily on the size of its population to count as a major economy of the world, than on the level of its per capita income. The per capita GDP in terms of purchasing power parity, okay, itself is indicating something. The difference between the purchasing power parity basis and the exchange basis is itself indicating something about what we are talking about here, which is why does $1 buy more in India? If you convert it into rupees at the exchange rate, why does it buy more in India than it buys in the US? And if it buys more, that is, in general, products in India are cheaper. Why isn't everybody in the world buying from India in this day of open economies, open trade, there's no restrictions on imports? Why isn't everyone buying from India? If it is true that the price of products in India are generally lower. And how in an open world is it possible for these different prices to be sustained? Clearly, the only commodities which can explain this difference are commodities which cannot be traded. Because if they can be traded, they will tend to have the same price. And if you look at products that are tradable, simple exercise, so go on Amazon, you buy a product in India, you look at the same product in the US, you're not convert at the current exchange rate, you're not going to find significant difference. So it is non-tradables which result in differences in price. And what underlies that difference in non-tradables? If you have to think of a reason why a non-tradable in India is cheaper, why is Kerala more expensive in the eyes of most people than other states in India? What's the difference? It's basically a story of wage rates. Kerala is more expensive because average wages in Kerala are higher than in the rest of the country. India is cheaper than other parts of the world because average wages in India are significantly lower. Now, if 90% of your population depends on that wage rate for an income, does the higher per capita income measured in terms of purchasing power parity basis reflect the prosperity of Indians or the poverty? So we are more prosperous than the current exchange rate basis tells us, because the purchasing power parity basis gives us a higher per capita income. But that higher per capita income on a purchasing power parity basis, if it is based on the fact that 90% of your population earnings, returns to laboring activity are significantly lower than in other parts of the world, then is that reflecting the greater prosperity of India or the greater poverty of India? So there are two different stories within that same process. Okay. And what you have seen is that a trend that wasn't existing in the past before India's insertion into the process of globalization, a very sharp trend of increased inequality, where basically the top 10% of the Indian population has now come to corner 56% of the total national income, and the remaining 90% has to make do with the balance 44%. Okay. So whether it's the next 40% or the bottom 50%, you've had a process where their share in this. So while per capita income has grown, it has grown very differently for the top 10% and for the remaining 90% of the population. And actually, if you look at India's position on the world map now, based on that, so what becomes India's position is that in per capita terms, it is one of the, on the lower end of the scale if you look at the spectrum of the world's countries. Okay, so the fact that in the bottom, in the top panel is the per adult income. So the lighter the color, the lower is the level of per capita income. So India is, because of being a lower middle income, is just above the lower income countries. So it is amongst the countries with the lower per capita income. And substantial parts of the world have significantly higher income. But when it comes to the share of the top 10% in the income, India is in the category with the darkest color, the highest. Okay. So the large majority of Indians live in a country which has a lower per capita income than most other parts of the world, but they also live in a country which has one of the most unequal distributions of that income. Okay, so they make up a significant part of the bottom of the world. Okay. Now, what is the process by which this inequality increases have actually happened? Okay. So if you look at the Indian economy at the beginning of the 90s, you still had an economy where significant part of the population was engaged in agricultural activities. Okay. So what's the first crisis that is talked about post 1991 in the Indian context? The first So essentially you have a situation, what is that meaning? Why was 2/3 of the Indian workforce still engaged in agricultural activities at the beginning of the 90s? That was the case because India's post-independence development had not created enough employment, non-agricultural employment, to be able to draw out the population which was dependent on agriculture. So even if agricultural income was low, per household income was low, better alternatives were not necessarily available, and therefore people did not move out of agriculture. Okay. So technically it was possible to produce that same agricultural output with much smaller proportion of the total labor force. But because of the absence of opportunities, people did not move out of agriculture into non-agriculture. So the agrarian sector was essentially the reservoir of India's surplus labor. The labor that could not be fully employed in productive activities stayed on in agriculture. Okay, and that was the way in which that surplus labor was also sustained. But what you get after 91 is an agrarian crisis, where the ability of that agricultural sector to sustain, because this high proportion of the labor force in agriculture is also in a context of rising population. So the number of people is continuously increasing. The land that is available for agricultural cultivation remains the same. So the land per household, per individual is continuously shrinking. You are compensating that up to a point by increased productivity of that land. But increased productivity of that land is also associated with increased costs of production. You have to put in more inputs into that land in order to get a higher output. And land typically, or agriculture in general, is what we call a diminishing return sector, where beyond a point that additional inputs don't produce a proportionate effect on output. So there was always a tendency, if you don't have a reduction in the number of people who are dependent on agriculture, for that process to reach a point at which incomes in agriculture would not be able to sustain the population dependent on it. And the changes in the economy after 1991 trigger the onset of that crisis in the middle of the 1990s. So the first crisis that we talked about in the post-91 India was the agrarian crisis, the inability of the agricultural sector to sustain a large population. And with that you have the beginning of actually an exodus from agriculture. Therefore the proportion of the population working in agriculture starts declining, and people start seeking work outside the agricultural sector. But what does that do? That essentially means that you have pushed. So agriculture was earlier serving as the reservoir for the surplus labor. They sustained on that basis. Now they can no longer sustain, and therefore they are being pushed out. But that doesn't necessarily mean that non-agricultural employment is being created. What you actually have is, so you have a decline in agriculture. Okay. You have virtually no significant increase in manufacturing. The main sector where you see significant increase is construction. Okay. Services, of course, also absorb some of the increase, but compared to the increase in services share in output, you have very little absorption in services. Okay. What you actually have is a process of a push out of agriculture without any pull factor at work. So it is not so earlier it was the absence of employment opportunities outside agriculture which kept people in agriculture. It is not that employment opportunities outside agriculture start getting created and therefore people start moving out of agriculture. but that agriculture can no longer sustain that same population, starts pushing people out of agriculture. So it's a push without a pull factor at work. So you have a decline in agricultural employment because of this push. Okay, but what's happening to total employment in the economy? It eventually actually starts stagnating towards the beginning of this century. There's virtually very little increase in employment that happens. And what you're therefore getting is a marked tendency of declining work participation, the proportion of the population which is actually employed. Okay. A large part of this decline and the absence of your working age population from actual employment is that burden largely falls on women. Okay. But it's not only with women that is happening, that's also happening with men. So if you look at the Indian economy, it is a distinct economy in which you have, so let's just in this table compare India with China. If the average productivity of the Chinese worker were to be the same as that of the Indian worker, the difference in the proportion which is employed would itself mean of China's per capita GDP on that count alone would be 1.5% of India's GDP. India has a employment proportion to population which is looks like some of the most oldest populations in the world. Countries with high aging populations, India's work participation looks like that. And we are supposed to be amongst the youngest populations in the world. So compared to the proportion of the population within the working age group, the proportion which is actually employed is very low. Okay. And that sets up conditions where essentially you have a labor market where large number of people are there who are available to work, but available to work at extremely low wages. And as long as that labor surplus situation continues, there is very little possibility of the economic context generating any tendency for increase in the returns to laboring activity. The remuneration received in exchange for laboring activity, there is no tendency for that to increase. So if you have that kind of a surplus situation persisting, then what may have started off as an agrarian crisis becomes a more generalized employment and incomes crisis. If such an employment and incomes crisis, if you have, therefore, those of you who are familiar with Arthur Lewis may recall this notion of unlimited supply of labor in a labor surplus economy, that at a certain given wage rate, you will always have enough labor available for whatever expansion you want, and until that labor reserve is exhausted, there will be no tendency for the wages to rise. So if you do not have adequate absorption outside agriculture, this labor surplus or unlimited labor supply situation tends to become permanent. Okay. And this is the result of that what is the average earnings of those who labor in the Indian economy as per official estimates, okay, of those who say India's economy is doing very well. From different sources you can see that the large majority of Indians, most of whom have to rely on one or the other kind of laboring activity, the average income levels from that laboring activity remain extremely low. Okay. This is 90% of the population. Sorry. Of course, this does not mean the fact that large number of people are not employed and therefore earning an income from labor doesn't mean they're idle. So if you look at the position of women, it's not that they're idle. As much time is being spent on employment is being spent by women in activities which are not considered employment, but which help to sustain a low wage, low income household. That is, they, with their own labor, provide the part of the requirements of sustaining the household, requirements which cannot be purchased in the market because the money income from laboring activity is inadequate. Okay. So the large majority of the population therefore gets trapped in this situation of low income, and until this labor reserve is exhausted, and there is no process of that happening, until that happens, there is no tendency for returns to labor increasing. Now, what happens then if you have growth and you have increases in per capita income? In that same social process of production, from that same social process of production, there are others who appropriate based on the fact that they own assets. They provide the assets for that activity, and that means that if the wage or the laboring activity tends to remain, returns to remain low, then the bulk of the any increase in income tends to go to those who have provide the assets, and that's top 10% of the population accounts for the bulk of the assets. Even 55% is a low estimation, because this particular calculation uses residential housing is also part of the assets that are owned. So for 90% of the population, it's primarily their own residential housing. That's their primary asset that they own. So they either are in self-employment with very little assets, or in wage employment, where the assets are provided by the asset owners, and the distribution of that income from that activity tends to largely go to the asset owners. Now, 10% of the top 10% of the population, of course, constitutes the primarily derive their income from ownership of assets. But there is a further concentration over and above that, and that takes place in the form of, and this is a particularly marked feature of the last 30 years, is the increased significance of the corporate sector. Now, we don't have data in which you can compare this, because of definitional changes, how the corporate sector share has in the economy has changed over time. But this is one proxy indicator which gives you a size. The private corporate savings essentially are the retained earnings of companies, okay, of the corporate sector. Out of the profits that they make, what is the portion that they retain? Okay. Now, this was less than 2% for most of India's independent history. It has now climbed to 10 to 12% on an average. And the biggest increase, if you see, took place in the short window of 5 years that preceded the 2008 global crisis. Recall, that's the period of the big boom, even in the Indian economy, when the Indian economy grew at a very fast rate. Okay, that's when the bulk of that increase takes place. So what you have is the top 10%, in their hands, ownership of assets is concentrated. That is then further concentrated by a process of pooling in the hands of corporate enterprises, which are controlled by a smaller number, much less than 10% number of business families. And if you look at within the corporate sector itself, from income tax data, it tells you that actually the level of concentration is exceptionally high. So while more than 8,41,000 companies, this is the last data that the income tax department has released, 8,41,000 companies were registered and filing income tax returns, just 353 of them accounted for almost 56% of the total profits. And this 353, okay, some are in the public sector, but large majority are in the private sector, and those that are not necessarily all separate companies. In that 353, you'd probably find Tata Steel, TCS, Tata Motors, all included. So several companies controlled by the same business family. So really a small handful of business families have come to occupy this position of the commanding heights of the economy, because it's not just a large share of the economy, it is their position, concentrated, dominant position in several key sectors of the economy that has been the result of this particular process. Okay. So the process of rising inequality in India post 1991 has been inevitably tied up with the process of increased corporate sector control and dominance over the India's economic structure. Okay. Of course, that corporate sector has also generated some high salary employment, and some of us who are in the public sector have been the beneficiaries of the spillover effects of that, in the form of some rise in public sector salaries also of a certain level. Okay. But if you look at that high salary employment relative to, so again, income tax data, high salaries don't escape the income tax net. Business incomes can, but high salaries don't. So this is a fairly comprehensive picture of the high salary situation in India. So 42,000 rupees in the year for which this data, you can say about 50,000 rupees today. So what proportion of the Indian population or the workforce earns more than 50,000 rupees a month today? It's less than 3% of the total workforce. So high salary employment is not the norm in India. And neither is it the case that the top 10% is primarily made up of high salaried individuals. It is primarily asset ownership that forms the basis for that 10%. Of course, there's overlap between those two categories also. Now, what is then the process that is at work? Okay. There are two kinds of processes you can say that are at work, and I would submit that what you have had is a transition from the first to the second. Okay. So again, students of development economics would be familiar with the notion of the vicious circle of poverty. The vicious circle of poverty essentially had there were two circles that were always talked about, that a developing country or underdeveloped economy typically is characterized by a labor surplus, capital scarce condition. And that condition tends to be reproduced rather than the constellation of forces is such that if you have low capital per labor, you have low per capita income. Low per capita income means low savings means low capital accumulation. Low capital accumulation means that the same situation persists. So that's one. The other circle that was talked about was you have low per capita income and therefore limited market, therefore the inducement to invest is also weaker, and because the inducement to invest is weaker, you have less capital formation, and therefore again that situation tends to persist. So underdeveloped economies were presumed to be trapped in that kind of a situation of vicious circle, which prevented them from escaping that. You could argue that while the economy as a whole may not be trapped in such a circle, the large majority who rely on laboring incomes as the basis for their livelihood, they are still trapped in that low wage, low income situation. And there are two parallel circles, vicious circles that operate. So if you have significant inequality, that inequality is associated with the fact that in production activity, the surplus that is generated over and above what goes to those who labor in that process is high. If that surplus is high, then it allows, so the savings allows you to capital accumulation at a high rate. But high capital accumulation can also take the form of not a proportionate increase in employment, but capital accumulation of a form which basically is labor substituting in character and therefore doesn't generate significant employment. If it doesn't, then the surplus labor situation is sustained and maintained, and therefore the conditions which give rise to that inequality are maintained, and this circle can go on repeating itself. The other is, if there is large inequality, then you have a narrow basis for the narrow market for the products that are produced with any investment. That leads to a demand constraint. If demand constraints weaken the inducement to invest, then you have low investment. If you have low capital accumulation, it will still be labor substituting in character, with the added thing that low accumulation will further depress the employment generation capacity, and therefore that circle continues to get repeated. Okay. Now, if you look at the Indian economy in that brief period up to 2008, you can say that the upper kind of circle was what was operating. But the upper kind of, if it keeps operating, then, and as the narrowness of the market keeps increasing because of the concentration of income at the top, increased inequality narrows the market further, then it slips into the second. And what seems to have happened in India is that that short period in which the upper circle happened has given way to a protracted phase in which what you see are tendencies of the vicious circle, where inequality is serving as the demand constraint. Now, what has reinforced this process in this period is this peculiar phenomena. When I say wages and returns to labor tend to stagnate and not rise, what does that mean? That means that people who work from labor, whatever money income that they receive, the quantity of goods and services they can purchase with that tends to remain the same. Okay. Money incomes can still increase. Money incomes can still increase if the prices of those commodities are going up. Now, what has been one of the features of this period is that while food prices have gone up significantly, manufactured goods tendency has been relative prices to decline. You can see it when you buy computers, when you buy phones. The process of cheapening is very perceptible. Okay. Even if you're paying the same amount, you're getting phones and computers with many more features, many more capacities today. When I first bought my PC, that was also 35,000 rupees in 1991. Okay. So, despite inflation, you can see that many manufactured commodities, even you look at prices of cars, they have started going up recently, but for several years there was no increase in their prices. So, productivity increases in manufacturing production globally have meant that manufacturing prices have relatively tended to decline, but food prices have gone up. So, in order for real wages to be constant, money wages have to basically track what happens to food prices, because if for low wage households, food constitutes the significant part of the consumption basket. In that time, manufactured goods and capital goods are manufactured goods. If they start becoming relatively cheaper, then you have this strange phenomena that you have real wage stagnation, being accompanied by labor becoming relatively more expensive. And therefore, the tendency to switch, to introduce, to use capital accumulation as a labor substituting method, that tendency becomes stronger. So, and this perpetuates or strengthens the tendency for the labor surplus to be continuously reproduced. This is a long-term trend that you can see that has been happening. And this basically reflects the difference in the movements of food prices and manufactured products. So, do you normally think of India as a low-wage economy with so-called comparative advantage in labor-intensive goods which require more labor related to capital? What you have is actually a reality where even in an economy like India, the process of replacing labor with capital is reinforced by this particular process. And actually, if you look at details of what has happened in different sectors, it has happened, the increase in the capital intensity has happened most rapidly in the most labor intensive sectors of the industrial sector. Okay. Now, what does this? So now, as I said, that India's economy experienced between the period 2003 to 2008, you had, if those of you can remember, we suddenly were in this phase where India's economy was experiencing growth rates which were unprecedented in its history. Okay. We had this big boom before the 2008 crisis. Okay. Now, India was not exhibiting in that a pattern that was fundamentally different from what was happening in the rest of the world. That period of the 5 years period leading up to the 2008 global crisis was a period of a global boom whose distinctive characteristic was that the developing countries of the world were not only growing faster than the advanced economies, but the gap between their growth rates also increased. So if you see that compare the black and the red curves in the period before that dip happens in with the 2008 global crisis, you can see that the gap has increased. And India, which is the dashed green line, is essentially following that pattern. Okay. In the period after the 2008 crisis, again, it appeared initially there was all this talk about countries like India and China leading the world out of the 2008 global crisis. That did not happen. The world economy's growth itself slowed down. And even the developing countries which were growing fast earlier, on average, their growth rate slowed down considerably. India was also following the same pattern till the introduction of a new GDP series in 2015 changed the picture. Now, I'm not going into the controversies about that, but India's growth rates changed once the new GDP series was introduced, and suddenly India looked to be amongst the fastest growing economies of the world. Okay. However, even the new GDP series couldn't prevent India's GDP growth from reflecting a process of successive deceleration from 2016-17 onwards. Now, you can correlate the demonetization, introduction of GST, and then COVID, 3 shocks. But what you get is every year the rate of growth of, before COVID itself, rate of growth of the Indian economy is continuously dipping. And we go back to the average pattern for the developing economies before COVID's effect, which is the second dip, happens. Okay. Before the COVID effect itself, we are back to the. So, even with the new GDP series, there was evidence to indicate that India was also Indian growth was also losing momentum in the second decade of the 21st century. Okay. But if you look at other indicators, you see even clearer evidence that long before the effects of COVID or even the effects of demonetization could be felt, India's economy was showing signs of losing the momentum that it seemed to have in that brief period of time before the 2008 global crisis. So if you look at investment in India, the capital accumulation process, and this is the clearest indication of the shift from that upper loop to that lower loop. So the period up to the 2008 global crisis is a period of growth in investment in India, in capital formation, that has no parallel in the history of independent India. In the short space of 5 years, the investment ratio, the proportion of GDP that is invested, went up by 8 to 9 percentage points in just 5 years because of very rapid growth of investment. But soon after the global crisis, that trend changed. And so in the last 20 years, you have both two unprecedented situations. One, the fastest rise in the investment ratio that you had ever seen, and the only period after independence in which you have seen such a protracted decline in that ratio. Because that investment boom itself collapses. And you have had a stagnation of investment for 10 years. Okay. You see, if you look at the structure of the economy, okay, agrarian sector in any case in crisis. If you look at even manufacturing in India, India was already not a significantly industrialized economy. The proportion of industry, manufacturing in total GDP was low. But India has become part of a global trend of deindustrialization, reducing significance of the manufacturing sector in the economy. That's the reason why the manufacturing sector in employment shows no increase. Okay. And if you, again, manufacturing is one sector where the new GDP series was the most controversial of what growth it was showing in the manufacturing sector. But if you take an alternative measure of what's happening to manufacturing output, which is the index of industrial production, then you see that this period of the second decade of the 21st century is India's second decade of industrial stagnation. Again, students of economics would be familiar with the so-called stagnation debate, which was all about the stagnation that set in towards the end of the third 5-year plan, the mid-60s to mid-70s decade. That is 1966 to 75. You've had exactly the same situation in the last one decade. So how is a booming economy in which the manufacturing sector itself was historically is a small proportion of output, where per capita consumption of manufactured products is very low compared to other countries, why is the industrial sector stagnating in such a booming economy? And is essentially stagnating because where does the source of demand for manufactured products come from? Either there's consumption demand, or there's demand generated by capital formation, or there's demand generated by external markets. India has not been very successful in export. In fact, it has tended to have deficits in its trade with the rest of the world in goods. It's a different position in services. Okay. India, if you have large section of the population stuck at a low income level, their demand does not diversify away from food and essentials towards manufactured products beyond a limited extent. So the only manufactured product which has penetrated, manufactured consumer durable, which has a large penetration in the Indian economy, is the mobile phone, because it is a much cheaper product. That's the only durable which has a wide penetration. The rest don't, because people don't have the means to buy. So the top 10%, however, as their incomes increase, they don't necessarily purchase manufactured consumption goods more and more. They tend to diversify away towards other services. So services don't necessarily face the same demand constraint that manufacturing production does. But if the overall market demand constraint situation also makes the top 10% not use its capacity to generate a large surplus to invest in capital formation, that source of demand for manufactured products also weakens. That is the reason why you have industrial sector also not being able to grow rapidly. So the result of this is that you have an arrested process of structural change in the economy. So you have services becoming a large part of the output, but services is not generating the employment. So this is I know it's a little complicated, but basically if you look at India relative to the other major economies of the world, India is not really a services dominated economy in the way that other countries are. The first column can be taken to be an index of the levels of industrialization. So India is at the bottom in that list. Okay. If you look at employment in services, India is again at the bottom, the proportion of employment in services. And please recall, this is an economy where the proportion of employment to population is itself lower. Okay, so the proportion of services and employment is much lower. And the only countries in this list which are highlighted in red, which have a share of services in GDP less than India. They also have higher share of services in employment. But they are basically have a lower share of services because they have a higher share of the industrial sector. So the process of structural change in which industrialization is a part may eventually lead to a situation where you have a service dominated economy in terms of both output and employment. But that's not the route in which India is traveling. And the fact that services don't generate significant employment has also got to do with the fact that the market for even services is narrow. So in the case of manufactured products, it is the growth of output that is affected by the narrowness of the market. In the case of services, it is the employment that is affected, the proportional amount of employment it can generate. Okay. They can demand high value services, but they don't necessarily. So in India, why is the services share in GDP high? Partly it is because of people like us. We are a very small part of the workforce, but our average salary, if you compare with the per capita income, is much higher. In the United States, a university professor's salary and their per capita income, if you compare, the distance will not be this significant. So and how is our contribution to GDP measured? By our salaries. That's the method. So that's partly the reason. Partly the reason is several services for which you may generate a demand, which may not be generated in the US. The number of people generating that demand is, if that proportion of the population is small, you generate less employment. How many drivers, maids can 10% of the population hire? They also can create only limited employment. How many people are required to give a good education to the top 10% or to good health care to the top 10%? So services employment that is generated, that's where you find the process. So what you actually have is a process of arrested structural change. All of this has of course happened in a context where, as I said, India's trade with the rest of the world has been characterized by, so India's insertion into globalization as far as the goods trade has been concerned, has on an average generated significantly larger imbalances than ever before. That's why the trade balance as a proportion of GDP during this period on an average has been much higher than it ever was. Okay. What has kept the current account balance somewhat in check is that this has been matched by or partly compensated by increased earnings of what we call invisibles. So, the two principal sources of invisible earnings for India are services exports, mainly IT and IT enabled services, and the second is remittances from Indians working abroad. Of course, Kerala is an important state as far as remittances are concerned. There's been an explosion of remittances from Indians abroad after 91. It's 3% of India's GDP. But both of these are returns from activity, essentially economic activity outside India. Services also, most of the services that are generating this are primarily exported. They are not sold in the domestic market significantly. They are primarily exported. So, but even with all of that, you have had a deficit in the current account. So, you have been dependent on inflows, capital inflows from outside to cover the deficit. How you are feeling, what kind of capital inflows you are getting to cover that deficit, that's what has changed after globalization, where foreign investment, which has two parts, portfolio investment, which is financial investment of a financial nature, and direct investment, which is investment for the purposes of producing something. That is. Now, because of the, if your trade is reflecting this situation that you are exporting much less than you are importing, what does that mean? That means you are not a competitive location for production of goods for the world market in significant range of products, and wherever you are competitive, that is relative to where you are not competitive is smaller. So, you export less and import more. But if that is the case, then you will also not get the FDI that is a feature of the globalization period, which is FDI which is seeking the cheapest locations to produce for the world market. What you tend to get much more is capital flows, FDI, which is intended to either for the domestic market, that is not generating exports, or you get more financial flows, which are coming into financial markets and are more volatile in nature. The consequence of that is, that your dependence on those capital inflows means you are potentially always in danger of instability in the foreign exchange market, because you are exposed to volatile capital flows, and therefore the restrictions that get imposed on your policy space are that much more stringent, because the first consideration in any policy is what's going to be the impact on your foreign exchange market, which essentially means that the state spending and taxation both have to be kept within limits. Okay. Now, even as far as these flows are concerned, we can see that between the first decade of this century and the second, a dramatic change has happened. So, exports and imports, as well as capital flows, as well as net earnings of invisibles, everything is far more depressed in the second decade as compared to the first. So, the global economic context and the stimulus that it was providing in the pre-2008 world, that is also no longer operative. But that has not meant that the implications for fiscal policy of the state are changing. So, throughout the period of globalization, the most important consideration when governments form budgets is, the most important variable is what? The fiscal deficit. Fiscal deficit is the difference between revenues and expenditures represents the total borrowing requirement of the government. So if you look at the central and state governments, the prioritization of the reduction in fiscal deficit at a time in which, because of being global and facing global competition, you have to keep your tax rates also within limits, has meant that expenditure as a proportion of GDP has always tended to be pulled down rather than stepped up. So if you have a low tax, low expenditure kind of fiscal policy context, then even the minimal requirement of addressing this growing divergence is not possible. The growing polarization that has characterized the economy, how do you address it? Either you have to have some mechanism of asset redistribution or some mechanism of income redistribution. If you are not having any asset redistribution, that's not on the agenda at all. Even income redistribution is not possible if you have a low tax, low expenditure regime. So you're locked into that situation where you cannot address that particular inequality, and therefore nothing can be done to change it. The post-COVID context has only aggravated this crisis, despite all these claims about high growth. So basically, because India's economy shrank more than most other economies, its recovery also meant a so-called higher growth, and therefore there was this exaggerated view of how rapid India's recovery is. Okay, and if you see the nature of that recovery in the tax revenues, you can see that the recovery has been marked by increased inequality. So without any increase in tax rates, if corporate tax and income tax as a proportion of GDP increase, what does that mean? That the incomes which underlie those taxes as a proportion of the national income have increased. The income taxes are all paid within the top 10%. Corporate taxes also come from earnings of that top 10%. So the recovery has been unequal, but the emphasis on bringing down the expenditure after just 1 year of increase in the first year of the COVID effect has been also visible. That is, already the process of reducing the expenditure has begun. So the grip of that situation where that you basically don't use fiscal policy for any kind of a redistributive mechanism, that grip is being reflected even in the current situation. Okay. So what does this all then mean? Because if you are now in this protracted phase, so why did I say at the beginning that there was a generalization of the crisis? Because what is the crisis which enabled this process of highly unequal growth? The agrarian crisis and the employment and income crisis, that's what kept the wage rate and returns to labor pegged at a low level. That's what created the cheap labor economy, which enabled this process of growth where the benefits were cornered by the top 10%. But the implications of that process for the domestic market and the inability to find export markets despite that cheap labor meant that that process of accumulation and growth could not sustain itself. And therefore that process of accumulation and growth, on the basis of that which that top 10% grew, that itself started facing a crisis, the evidence of which is in what has happened in the last 10 years, the decade even preceding the global crisis. You can see that process of thing. But what is the implication of that generalization of the crisis? Does that mean that the social forces the social political forces that articulate the interests of the top 10% would be now pushing for a reduction in inequality, an increase in taxes, an increase in expenditure which would benefit the remaining 90%? an increase in wages? No. The crisis only reinforces their interest in the opposite. That is, the tendency is for them to seek a solution to their crisis by further aggravating the employment and incomes crisis on the basis of which they had achieved their earlier growth. So, left to themselves, that tendency does not lead in the direction of any resolution of a crisis. But this 10%, and particularly when it has this concentrated form in the hands of a few corporate groups occupying significant position in the economy, also has an implication for how your political system works. So, if you look at this 30-year period, can anyone say that this particular pattern of economic polarization was the choice of the Indian people? That they exercised through, that they achieved through how they exercised their choices in the ballot box? Or did it happen despite their choices? So there was a process of hollowing out of Indian democracy that was at work throughout this particular period. And this was, initial reflection was what? Its initial reflection was that if you think about it, look at the 90s and the period till the mid 2000, first decade of the. If you looked at the pattern in Indian elections, you had continuous process of governments being voted out. And the so-called incumbency, anti-incumbency factor was the generalized explanation for Indian electoral results. Okay. So somewhere that underlying reality was being reacted to, but the structural realities of the economy. One, you have an exposure to volatile capital flows, and which shrinks your policy space. When you shrink your policy space and you allow corporate groups to acquire dominant positions in the economy, their leverage over the system also increases. Leverage over the state also increases. The state, even if it wants to generate employment, even if it is not corrupt, how does it do it? The only route to any kind of economic is through private investment. Because the state doesn't have the means to do so. So even if there's no corruption, what the state does is structurally determined, not decided by elections. So governments could change, but nothing changed as far as the fundamental policy paradigm was concerned. It has become stronger, stronger, and stronger. So that was the first reflection. This anti-incumbency for a period of time appeared to weaken in the 2010s, when several governments appeared to get themselves re-elected on the basis of popular schemes that they initiated. What was the background to that? The 2008, the boom before 2008 was highly inegalitarian, but one of the implications of that was that tax revenues increased. That's the only period in which tax revenues to GDP increased in the post-91 India. When that happened, for a period of time, even while reducing the fiscal deficits, governments could step up expenditure. That's the period in which NREGA happened, Food Security Act, etc., all that came to be talked about. Various schemes of different state governments, Nitish Kumar's Cycles for Women and Mamata Banerjee's schemes, many of these things happened during that period of time, where there was a brief window in which it was possible to both step up public expenditure as well as reduce the fiscal deficit. But once the momentum in the economy was lost, that process changed. And from the beginning of the 2010s, what you have is actually a retreat to fiscal consolidation. So up till 2008, because of growing revenues, some expenditure step up could happen. Immediately after 2008, the whole world was doing fiscal stimulus in response to the 2008 global crisis. For a few years, you had still had expenditure. India also followed fiscal stimulus. But by the beginning of the decade, the retreat from that stimulus started. So then again, there was no possible intervention which could arrest that process of loss of momentum. And then you see this long period in which of that loss of momentum. As this loss of momentum is taking place, the contradictions are becoming sharper. So what is the root? If you cannot have expansion of the economy, expansion of production as the basis for corporate sector's accumulation and growth, what is the only other alternative? The only other alternative is that it has to start encroaching on the parts of the economy that are not under its control. And there is a push towards such a parasitic tendency emerging within the Indian economy. You could think of, there are explicit things like the farm laws as an example of that attempt. Agriculture being one sector which still is largely outside direct corporate control. You could think of other mechanisms, use of technologies, digital technologies, etc., to take over activities which may have been part of India's large and organized sector. Okay. So there is that tendency that is getting strengthened. On the other hand, you want lesser taxes, more expenditures to be in the interests of, so you want roads and highways to be built, but you don't necessarily want other infrastructure to be created. You don't want more expenditure on education and health or all these things. So the contradictions and all of these processes mean that the employment and incomes crisis has to become stronger. So the contradictions are in many ways are becoming stronger. Okay. And that also explains why India's social and economic elite in general is so unified in its backing of authoritarianism and communalism, increasing authoritarianism and communalism of the Indian state, because that appears to be the only possible way of dealing with this increased contradictions, these sharpening contradictions in society. Okay. But that process itself is no magic wand. You can see clearly evidence that so even if you try and use religious nationalism to unify large sections of the Indian population and provide a cover for any other interests to be, all other interests to be kept in check, even if you can do that, there's still a large minority population. So that method itself generates some bit of disorder. It's not adequate to impose that order. But even if you take the non-minority population, what does the evidence indicate? The evidence actually indicates that you are getting everywhere, no matter what the final electoral results based on the arithmetic work out to be, you're getting everywhere a tendency for a social polarization between some part which is aligned in a certain way and the other, where the distance between these parts is actually increasing. So if you look at the UP elections and the Karnataka elections, the results are very different. But there's something common that you see in both. Not a reduction in the ruling party's share in the vote, but a consolidation of support behind the most strongest opponent. In Karnataka, it produces a defeat of the ruling party. In UP, it didn't go far enough for that to happen, but you had the same process happening. In the form of, say, the struggle of the farmers, you can see that this process cannot necessarily put a lid on the contradictions that exist. Okay. So, you can also see as part of this very process increasing tensions in the federal structure. It gets articulated when you have different political formations in the state governments. This process of centralization is also creating increasing tensions. So you think about, for example, there is a very real South versus North issue emerging. The South is more advanced, more developed, it has a lower population growth. So one issue that is emerging is about the allocation of central tax revenues between center and between the different states. So if you take population and you have a system which tends to favor the poorer states, the South has a complaint that we are losing out because we did better. Our population share is coming down. Our developmental indicators are more advanced. So we are paying the price, because of which we are getting less. If tomorrow then this process, if you have new delimitation, it can mean a change in the proportions of different regions in the makeup of the Indian Parliament. So there are potential tensions or contradictions of this kind which can also emerge. So you can say that the current condition is one in which it's one kind of expression of an attempt to impose an order on a state of disorder, but that is also generating its own kind of disorder. Now, either these social contradictions will have political expressions which force the change that is required for these contradictions to be fundamentally addressed, or they will have other expressions. What they may be, I cannot speculate, but I wouldn't like to live to see the effects of those. I wouldn't want to risk going down that particular path, because I don't know where that is, what kind of anarchic situation that might lead to in the coming years. However much we may feel confident about our society and our nation, we are a society and a nation with several fault lines. And we've seen several societies in the last 30 years break apart. Societies with fewer fault lines break apart, and 10 years before it happened, no one thought it was going to happen. So we should not feel very confident that no matter what, if it goes down this path, whatever other problems, our future as a society, as a nation, is not really in peril or at risk. You never know when all these different things combine and what they necessarily are going to produce. So therefore, the only thing I can say is that for all of us, it's perhaps better to do what we can to not let history answer whether that path will lead to anarchy or not, but to prevent that possible outcome and to find a different, more productive route out of the present crisis. With that, let me conclude. Thank you so much for your patience. Okay.